imagine being an athlete being forced to compete against Ukrainian athlete competing against a Russian athlete. I mean, it's just absurd. It needs to stop. The IOC needs to stop playing games, and they need to start listening to athletes, quite frankly.
Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser last year called for a blanket ban on their participation. But yesterday, she said that the UK supports the IOC's decision to allow them to compete under a neutral flag. So today we're asking you this. Should Russian and Belarusian athletes be banned? Is it fair to hold individuals accountable for the actions of their government? I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on that. Get in touch, 87222, if you want to text us. Start your message with the word Times. Or you can WhatsApp us, 0333 003 2353. I'm joined now by Rob Koehler, Director General of Global Athlete, an international organisation led by athletes for athletes. And also alongside him is our very own John Cushing, sports journalist and co-host of the Anything But Footy podcast, who always joins me here on a Saturday to talk about sport. So, Rob and John, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alexis.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with you, Rob. You support this U-turn by the government. You're quite happy to see these athletes not be allowed to take part in the Olympics. Tell us why.
It's not my personal view. It's actually the view of thousands of athletes. Over the past year, couple of years, we look at the landscape. Over 300 fencers, international fencers, have called for both Russia and Belarusian athletes to be suspended. We had over 1,000 Olympic and Paralympic athletes sign. We Canadian athletes sign, German athletes sign, to say that Russia and Belarus should not be at the games. And the simple reason is that since the Russian anti-doping scandal, Russia has undermined the complete ethics of the Olympic movement. They undermine it by statewide institutionalized doping. And then on the heels of Sochi Olympic Games, they invaded Crimea and then, of course, broke the Olympic truce when they invaded after the Beijing Olympic Games. And Russia and sport go together. You cannot separate the state from sport. And we've seen in the past that Vladimir Putin will use every ounce of their athletes' participation, whether they're neutral athletes, which we've seen in the past, or not, to promote his propaganda. And he's using those athletes as political pawns during these games. And we know, and this is not anecdotal, athletes in Russia have no choice. You either follow the rules, do what you're told, or you're kicked out. So, it's time for the IOC to maintain its ban. And people forget the IOC fully banned Russia right after their invasion following the the Beijing Olympic Games, when it didn't matter. But now that it matters and they want to cozy up to Russia, they've now allowed neutral athletes, which we have seen from many cases where the neutral athlete is very loose, and athletes that have links with the military have been permitted and allowed to go so far. So it's a big farcical facade, and the IOC has totally let down athletes, because athletes have called for this, not us.
Okay. John, as a sports journalist, you feel slightly differently about this matter. You think that they should be allowed to compete under a neutral flag.
Yeah, and I've changed my mind on that. And that's what I think is really an interesting point. And look, I agree with what Rob has said in terms of the history of Russia. You cannot take Russia away from sport or sport away from Russia. I agree with that. And I also agree with him that the drugs ban, the state-sponsored drugs ban, was not really a ban. So the Russian Olympic Committee still went to the Olympics. It was known as ROC. It was still on the medal table. It still was the color of red, white, and blue of the Russian flag. So and I remember literally screaming at the Beijing Winter Games at one point when the commentator was saying the Russians winning, and I was like, Russia are not in it. It's rock, but it was very much a ban, but it wasn't really a ban. Now, as I said, I totally respect Rob and all the work that he does at Global Athlete and what they stand for, but I think this is a tougher stance that the Olympics are taking against the Russian and Belarusian athletes this time. Rob mentioned about the neutral athletes. Now, what the big difference is this time is that there's a new flag. In fact, there's a new you get an abbreviation for every team that competes in the Olympics. The 200 teams that compete in the Olympics, you get an abbreviation, and this is the AINs. This is the individual neutral athletes. There is a totally new flag for them. There's a totally new anthem. They will not be in the parade at the opening ceremony. They will not appear in the medal table, and that's what I think, that they are tougher this time on Russia than they were previously. And the reason why I've changed my mind is that I've seen this work firsthand at Wimbledon. I went to Wimbledon last year, Alexis. I remember talking to you about it when I was there, and it worked really well. Medvedev, Sabalenka, Russian and Belarusian athletes, no one referred to them as that. On the scoreboards, there was no mention where they were from. They just had no initials next to them on websites or on scoreboards. And it was just, yes, there was some reaction to that, but I really felt like if it's working in tennis, it can also work at the Olympics. Okay. And I think they've been tougher this time than they have previously.
Okay, Rob, what do you make of that? They are being tougher, as you said. You heard there what John had to say. What would be wrong about allowing those athletes who cannot be connected? They won't be shown in the medals table. They won't have any association. They're just athletes who've just been training for 4 years to get to those Olympics. Would you have issue with that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, just what John just said is, you look at previous games when there were Olympic athletes of Russia or Russian athletes from the Olympic Committee, the media still referred to and draw attention to these athletes are neutral athletes. These athletes are from Russia. The media will explain it. And all you have to look is the history. Kamila Valieva, who's a figure skater that tested positive, Russian figure skater in Beijing, she tested positive. She's been banned for 4 years. And what is the first thing that Vladimir Putin does? He gives him an award. She gives her an award. They are paraded through all the streets and media outlets as a hero of the country. That's what he's going to do. So, I mean, you have to remember that they use this for state propaganda better than any other country in the world. So this neutrality, it shows Russia that they can continue to undermine the system. The IOC is favoring 2 Olympic committees, the Belarusian and the Russian Olympic Committee, over the other 204 national Olympic committees. And who suffers all the time? Imagine being an athlete being forced to compete against a Ukrainian athlete competing against a Russian athlete. I mean, it's just absurd. It needs to stop. The IOC needs to stop playing games, and they need to start listening to athletes, quite frankly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thousands of athletes have called for this, and the IOC continues to ignore and cast aside these calls.
Yeah, Matthew Syed, who writes for the Sunday Times, is vehemently opposed to allowing Russian athletes to keep competing. I mean, he made the point, John, that perhaps this Ukrainian athlete that we're imagining now, that Rob sort of, lining up against a Belarusian or a Russian athlete who perhaps, I don't know, who's Ukrainian athletes, their track might have been bombed. He can't have been able to train, whereas the Russian athlete has had everything given to them from the Russian state. And yes, even though he's not running under, or they are not running under their own flag, they're still having an unfair advantage. I mean, how can that be right? I know that you said that in Wimbledon it's worked well, but we're only talking about 1 or 2 athletes now. We're going to be talking about plenty more across many, many sports.
Yeah, but tennis is one of the biggest sports in the world, Alexis, and it works week in, week out. And yes, Ukrainians have to play Russians or Belarusians and vice versa. And look, I have total sympathy for what Ukraine is going through and Ukrainians are going through. And I can't imagine what it would be like. Now, we all, as individuals, have to say, do I want to go and compete against this person? Do I want to stand here and compete against them? And I think I did say that the Olympics are going to be stronger on this. They have said that any athlete who actively supports the war will not be eligible to be entered or to compete. There are 5 or 6 strict eligibility guidelines that they have put through. When they first announced this in December, I think there were about 6 or 7 Russian or Belarusian athletes who had qualified for the games, compared to 60 Ukrainians who'd already qualified. So I do think the numbers will be lower. And I take the point that Rob was making about Valieva in the Beijing Winter Olympics. but again, she was wearing red, white, and blue. I repeat, there was this rock, there was this Olympic committee. It was still called Russian Olympic Committee, and it is the job of the media to actually not call them Russian, not call them Belarusian. I spent the whole 2 weeks covering Wimbledon. I never mentioned where Azarenka was from or where Medvedev was from. As the media, we also have to take responsibility, and the commentators have to take responsibility and say that this is an athlete who is literally doing their job. Ultimately, they are individual athletes and they want to compete, and they go around the world and they compete. Now, of course, the big difference is, I will just say this, is that World Athletics have said that they will not be allowing neutral athletes to compete. So Seb Coe, he's having an interesting couple of weeks actually at the moment, because he's going up against Thomas Bach, who is the president of the Olympics, because not only is they said they will not allow these neutral athletes to compete in athletics, they will be in other events. They're also, of course, now paying people to win gold medals, which the Olympics is not happy about either. So there is a real clear line between what Seb Coe is saying, and he wants to be the next president of the Olympics. They're really making it really clear that where they want to go. So even within sport, everyone can't agree.
Okay.
But I think it's a facade as well. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's a facade as well, and the IOC knows it's a facade. And I give one example. There's a reason why the IOC has not allowed team sports to compete from Russia and Belarus. So they realize that they use it for state propaganda. They realize they can't have team sports. So they've banned all team sports from Russia and Belarus, but they haven't banned individuals. So, you can't do both. So you either ban everyone or you don't
Rob,
ban.
I don't understand that. Why can you explain that to us? Why would they ban team sports but allow individual athletes?
Well, we don't understand it either. So they can't have a basketball team.
John, any ideas? Maybe John's got the answer.
Well, they're not. They're because they're individual neutral athletes who are competing under this new anthem, under this new flag.
But why
why
can't a team compete under a neutral flag?
Because they are a team, and they're a team of Russian athletes. And
well, arguably,
so
you would have rowers as a team as well. So you have rowers in the quad. You have relay teams. Well, you won't have it in Russia because athletics is banned. But you have other teams, quote, that don't fall into team sport categories, but they compete as more than one person in an event.
But it is to stop this whole using, as Rob says, and this is what I'm saying, they are being more strict than they ever have been before. They really have banned Russia and Belarus from the Olympics, but some individual neutral athletes will compete, and I do think that is a difference.
Okay, I have to draw it to a close there. It's been fascinating to get both of your opposing views